Good afternoon. My name is Kayla Bridgham, and I'm a political science student here at NC State. My research this summer has centered around the government bailout of GM and Chrysler and actions taken by Ford, GM, and Chrysler leading up to the bailout that influenced the opportunity for government aid. The actions of the Big Three, including restructuring, labor negotiations, and government involvement, led to a variation in outcomes for each company. This research is part of a greater project conducted by my mentor, Dr. Mark Nance. Dr. Nance's research examines the outcomes of automakers in Sweden, Germany, and the US, and hypothesizes a link between the variety of capitalism in each country and the outcome of each country's automakers. This presentation is a progress report of my research thus far. I will describe the similarities and differences I found in the actions of the Big Three automakers and explain how I believe each of the Big Three's varying needs for government aid were influenced by each company's organizational culture. Before I began to document the actions taken by the Big Three and the outcomes resulting from these actions, I spent time reading about process tracing and valuable research techniques, articles in which researchers shared best practices for the research process. Through these how to conduct research articles, I gained an understanding of the importance of turning my daily field notes into memos. After completing my research each day, I spent time reflecting my findings in short memo form, allowing me to keep track of valuable discoveries or ongoing questions. Throughout my investigation of the Big Three and events leading up to the bailout, I used the process tracing approach to understand how each action by the automakers, union, or government interacted to create the outcomes witnessed during the bailout. I utilized primary sources from members of the Obama administration's Team Auto and C-SPAN footage from congressional hearings. These insider accounts gave me insight into deliberations and meetings among government personnel, auto company leadership, and union representatives that were helpful in explaining the outcomes of government aid and union concessions for each automaker. Further, I read secondary sources from auto industry experts and journalists, which helped solidify the history of the automakers and company decisions that led to government aid. These sources detailed outside influence on the auto industry, such as rising gas prices and the introduction of foreign car companies into the US. Other secondary sources included commercials released by the Big Three and comedic renditions of congressional hearings that reflected public sentiment on the bailout. Both the primary and secondary source material provided the dates of company restructurings, congressional hearings, stock market activity, and meetings between actors. I compiled these dates into a timeline that illustrated the interconnected actions that led to the outcomes of each automaker. I then used the narratives included in the sources and the timeline to create a case brief for each automaker that documented company actions and interactions before, during, and after the recession and subsequent bailout. Prior to the recession, GM and Chrysler and Ford faced losses in market share and declining sales due to foreign competition, vehicle quality, and rising gas prices. The SUV boom of the late 90s and early 2000s led to an unhealthy dependence on SUVs, minivans, and light trucks, debilitating the Big Three's ability to compete with Honda, Toyota, and other foreign automakers. The Big Three relied on discounts in light truck sales throughout the early 2000s, but the need for quality improvement in fuel-efficient cars continued to grow as the domestic automakers' shares rapidly shrunk. GM, Ford, and Chrysler took similar restructuring steps in job cuts and plant closures, but differed in intensity and timing. Between late 2005 and early 2006, GM and Ford began restructuring projects that included employee buyouts and plant closures. Ford's restructuring plan, called the Way Forward, was announced in early 2006. The plan included tens of thousands of job cuts and 14 plant closures. Additionally, Ford would secure a $25 billion loan by leveraging all of the company's assets. Throughout the first stages of restructuring, Ford worked closely with United Auto Workers, keeping the union informed of major changes. Former Boeing executive Alan Mulally replaced Bill Ford as CEO of Ford in September of 2006. The restructuring efforts continued with Mulally, who sold luxury brands Jaguar and Range Rover to reduce the company's unprofitability. GM similarly began layoffs and plant closures, but relied more heavily on discounts and rebates. GM's Employee Discount for Everyone program increased sales for a short time but cost GM almost $1 billion. GM CEO Rick Wagoner did not pursue selling any of GM's unprofitable brands despite a $40 billion loss in 2007. GM attempted to acquire a loan from Wall Street creditors in late 2007, but by this time the debt market was in abysmal shape because of the credit crisis. Meanwhile, Chrysler was changing hands. In February 2007, Daimler Chrysler introduced Project X, a restructuring plan that included 13,000 job cuts and closed plants, but the UAW refused to budge on Chrysler's $20 billion in healthcare and pension liabilities. Project X failed to create a significant change in Chrysler's financial situation and Daimler sold Chrysler to Cerberus in late 2007. As the financial states of all three automakers continued to worsen, the issue of the automakers' multi-billion-dollar healthcare and pension liabilities was made abundantly clear. GM alone held over $50 billion in healthcare liabilities. Each of the automakers needed healthcare concessions from the union, but historical relationships and trust determined different outcomes for the company's new contract. When the Big Three's labor contracts expired in 2007, GM was the first to begin negotiations. The agreement was finalized in September after a summer of negotiations. GM was able to secure a two-tier wage structure that would allow the company to pay a lower wage to newly hired workers and a voluntary employees beneficiary association, or VIBA trust, into which GM would contribute $35 billion in cash for retiree healthcare. The VIBA trusts were meant to reduce the automakers' healthcare liabilities, as the trusts were independent of the companies. Further, the establishment of the trust secured retiree benefits in the event of bankruptcy and lessened the gap in retiree costs and liabilities between domestic automakers and the transplants. UAW Chrysler negotiations got off to a rocky start, resulting from Chrysler's new ownership and lack of familiarity and trust between Cerberus and the UAW. On October 24th, Chrysler secured job security provisions for 80% of the union employees, a mostly stock-funded VIBA, and savings on retiree benefits during negotiations. Disagreements between local union members of both GM and Chrysler led to strikes at both companies before the labor contracts were signed. Ford was the last to negotiate, beginning directly after Chrysler's contract was signed. Bill Ford decided to back out of an agreement between the Big Three to unite against the UAW, called Project Compass. This decision enabled a greater collective bargaining process in which Ford secured more generous concessions than GM and Chrysler, with a VIBA trust for retiree healthcare funded mostly in stock, an allowance to hire more lower-tier workers. The healthcare trusts and two-tier wage allowances granted by the union counteracted historical labor victories and past company concessions. However, the UAW's concessions were not able to fully counteract the effects of the recession that further depressed sales and eliminated the debt market, causing the Big Three to turn to the government for help. The Big Three appealed to Congress for aid in late 2008. The automakers hoped for a loan from the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which was signed by President Bush to strengthen struggling private institutions during the financial crisis. Ford, GM, and Chrysler initially asked for a $25 billion bridge loan, but were denied. After the first round of failed hearings, Ford decided to forego TARP aid, a move that would improve Ford's public perception and protect the Ford family Class B shares, which gave them majority votes in the company from a disorderly bankruptcy. GM and Chrysler asked Congress for $18 billion and $7 billion, respectively. After an aid bill died in the Senate, President Bush authorized the use of TARP loans for GM and Chrysler and ordered the two companies to submit viability plans by February 2009. President Obama took office in 2009 and assembled Team Auto, a task force charged with overseeing the restructuring of GM and Chrysler. Obama's Team Auto was composed of economic experts and government personnel, but had a noticeable lack of automobile industry expertise. In 2009, the bailout outcomes of the Big Three became clear. Ford's decision to go without government aid caused a rebound in stock prices. The Drive One campaign increased customer perception of Ford vehicles, and the company regained profitability in the third quarter of 2009. Chrysler received a $4 billion TARP loan in January 2009. GM received a $13.4 billion TARP loan in 2008. Both automakers failed to create aggressive viability plans by February 17th. Team Auto began working closely with GM and Chrysler during this time. At GM, Team Auto dismissed CEO Rick Wagoner and sold off brands. After deciding to save Chrysler, Team Auto got to work securing an alliance with Fiat. However, neither GM or Chrysler shareholders could agree on the terms of the restructuring. Both Chrysler and GM would utilize a Section 363 bankruptcy, which allowed the companies to split into two entities. One entity would get all the assets and emerge from bankruptcy, while the other would remain in bankruptcy and sell off all liabilities. Chrysler entered bankruptcy on April 20th, 2009. Bankruptcy proceedings ended on May 31st, and the 363 sale was finalized on June 9th. Chrysler received $1.9 billion in the form of debtor-in-possession financing. Upon exit, Chrysler received the final installment of $4.6 billion in TARP aid. GM entered bankruptcy on June 1st, 2009. When shiny new GM emerged from bankruptcy a little over a month later, the government provided GM with a final TARP loan of $30.1 billion and owned 60% of the new company. Despite similar restructuring actions of job cuts, plant closures, and healthcare concessions from the UAW, the outcomes of the big three were different. Ford borrowed billions to restructure in 2006 and successfully weathered the recession without additional aid. Team Auto deemed GM too big to fail, but the automaker needed $50 billion in aid throughout the rescue. Chrysler received much less government aid, but was pushed into an alliance with Fiat as Team Auto did not believe the automaker could function independently. There are several alternate explanations for the variation in outcomes. I believe that the differences in each company's organizational culture was the primary cause for the differing outcomes between GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Organizational culture includes the norms and rules that govern interactions between members of an organization and related parties, which in this case means the UAW and the government. While I documented the actions of each automaker, I noticed definitive contrasts in the way each company dealt with reporting within the company, executive privilege, and differences in relationships with the UAW. For example, Team Auto's review of GM found excellent mechanisms for reporting. The problem was that the reporting mechanisms never led to any real consequences for poor performance, leading to a culture of mediocrity and going with the mainstream. GM's hypothesized organizational culture could explain GM's reluctance to fully confront the company's issues before and during the credit crisis with intensity. As a result, the credit crisis was the last straw for GM, who had been treading water for months with only the bare bones of a restructuring plan. At Ford, CEO Bill Ford recognized the obstacles his company was facing and stepped down in 2006 to allow for a more dramatic restructuring process led by automotive outsider Alan Mulally. Further, the 2007 negotiations between Ford and the UAW demonstrated remarkable trust between the two actors and were resolved without a strike, unlike at GM and Chrysler. Bill Ford influenced the organizational culture at Ford to usher in a new era for the company, in which issues are fully recognized and dealt with when they arise. Ford's transparency during labor negotiations helped the automaker to gain more concessions, cut costs, and avoid requiring government aid. Finally, Chrysler's continual change of ownership seemed to jeopardize the company's chances of collective UAW relations and a coherent, stable organizational culture. The abrupt change of ownership from Daimler, a German automaker, to Cerberus, an American private equity firm, brought about varying management styles, auto expertise, and union trust. These instances of interactions led me to hypothesize a link between organizational culture and these outcomes from the bailout. Further research may utilize Cameron and Quinn's 4 types of organizational culture to analyze the specific traits of each company and how they affected the actions and outcomes of the automakers. This alternate explanation serves to analyze and explain the overarching response of the US government to GM and Chrysler and the processes that led to a need for the bailout in the first place. Additional research will provide further explanations and provide insight into a possible primary cause of the outcomes. Thank you for your time.